What if the very first spark of spirituality did not come from a god, a ritual, or a symbol, but from a silent moment when an early human stared into the dark and felt something staring back? Imagine a world where language barely existed, where thought was raw and survival was everything, yet somehow an invisible presence began to take shape inside the human mind. The question is unavoidable. How did beings who did not even have words understand the sacred? This is where the mystery begins. In a landscape filled with predators, firelight, and shadows that moved like living stories. When our ancestors sat around the first controlled fires, they were not only warming their bodies. They were facing the unknown, feeling the boundary between danger and meaning. The play of light and darkness created shapes on the cave walls, and in those shifting forms, something ancient stirred. A sense of awe, a sense of fear, a sense that the world was more than what could be touched. It was in these moments that the earliest seeds of faith may have emerged, long before religions, temples, or deities had names. Picture a small group of early humans hearing the wind howl through the trees. To us, it is just wind. To them, it was a voice, a force, a message. Without scientific understanding, every sound held intention, every movement in nature suggested a hidden presence. The environment itself became a teacher, shaping intuition and prompting the first spiritual sensations. This was not organized belief. It was instinct meeting imagination, biology meeting mystery. And maybe you have felt something similar, a moment when the world seemed to speak without words. You might have noticed how this ancient feeling still lives inside us, even after millions of years of evolution. That lingering sense that some things cannot be fully explained, only felt. You already know how powerful this connection can be, and as we explore it, you may even recognize pieces of your own inner world, reflected in those distant ancestors. Before we go deeper, tell me something. Have you ever experienced a moment that felt bigger than logic? A moment where the atmosphere around you shifted in a way you could not define? Share your experience in the comments. And while you are here, check if you are subscribed, leave your like and stay with me, because what you are about to uncover may reshape the way you imagine the past. This feeling is only the beginning, and it opens a path that leads us into the next layer of humanity's oldest search for meaning, where instinct begins to transform into something far more profound. To understand how the earliest humans sensed something sacred, we must step into the moment they first confronted death, not as an event, but as a threshold. The body of a fallen member of the group was more than a lifeless form. It was a silent question that no instinct could fully answer. Our ancestors, who lived by observing every movement of nature, suddenly faced something that did not move, did not breathe, did not react. And yet, it felt present in a strange and unsettling way. This was likely the first time they encountered a phenomenon that demanded a deeper interpretation, a phenomenon that could not be hunted, outrun, or ignored. Around the stillness of death, a primitive awareness began to form, hinting that life was not only physical survival, but something carried beyond the body. Imagine a small group gathering around a deceased companion. The wind sweeps through the grass, and their eyes search for signs, for meaning, for whatever force might be responsible for taking someone away. They had no words for spirit, but they had emotions powerful enough to give shape to the invisible. The sudden absence of movement, the emptiness in the eyes of someone they once followed or trusted, created a gap that imagination rushed to fill. They may have believed that the world around them had claimed the person, or that some unseen presence had crossed into their circle. This encounter with mortality planted the deepest roots of spirituality, the idea that something continues, transforms, or watches, the idea that death itself is a doorway. As time passed, behavior changed. The early humans began to treat corpses differently, not because of tradition, but because instinct urged them to. Some remains were covered with stones or leaves, others were placed carefully in specific spots. These actions did not yet resemble rituals as we know them, but they carried intention. To place a body somewhere was to acknowledge that its presence mattered even after life ended. This simple gesture marks one of the oldest clues to spiritual awareness. It reflects an intuition that the dead still held meaning, that their essence lingered or needed protection, or perhaps that leaving them exposed might disturb forces they barely understood. The fear of the unknown played a crucial part in shaping this emerging sense of the sacred. Death was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and final in a way nothing else was. Every encounter with it amplified the feeling that invisible powers were involved in human destiny. The night became heavier, the silence more expressive, and the separation between the living and the dead more mysterious. The earliest humans learned to walk carefully around this boundary, sensing that the world was larger than their immediate survival. They began to distinguish between what could be touched and what could only be felt, forming the foundations of belief long before the first myths were spoken. And as their understanding of this threshold deepened, something even more intricate began to grow inside their minds, something that would soon transform the way they interacted with the forces of nature and with their own inner world, shaping the next steps of humanity's search for meaning. As early humans continued to navigate a world filled with danger and uncertainty, they began to realize that nature itself seemed to communicate through patterns they could not ignore. Fire, especially, became one of the most powerful symbols in this emerging sense of spirituality. At first, it was simply a tool for survival, a source of warmth, protection, and cooked food. But over time, its unpredictable movements, the way flames twisted and danced, created a sense of presence that felt alive. Sitting around a fire meant entering a space where shadows shifted, where the ordinary blended with the mysterious, and where the boundary between the visible and the invisible felt thinner than anywhere else. It was here, between sparks and darkness, that early humans began interpreting the world through a growing spiritual intuition. Imagine the scene. The night is silent, except for the crackling of firewood. A group of early humans watches the flames rise, flicker, and fall, each movement resembling a gesture or whisper. Without language to explain their sensations, they relied on instinct. If a flame jumped higher when the wind surged, it might have seemed like a sign. If sparks flew upward and vanished into the night sky, perhaps they believed something was being carried away or released. The fire spoke in a language that was not made of words but of impressions, rhythms, and emotions. It became a companion, a guide, a force that reshaped their understanding of the world. Fire revealed that nature was not silent. It was expressive. The same happened with storms. Lightning that tore through the sky. With brutal intensity, thunder that rolled across the land like the footsteps of an invisible being. Sudden winds that carried the scent of danger or change. Each event pushed humans to look beyond the physical explanation. They felt that something larger was acting upon their world with intention. These natural forces were too powerful, too dramatic, too overwhelming to be purely accidental. Early humans began linking these events to their lives, believing that the environment reacted to them or influenced their fate. This is where the earliest seeds of interpretation appeared, transforming raw survival instincts into spiritual perception. Gradually, the natural world became a map of meanings, a strange cloud formation, a sudden calm after chaos, the way animals behaved before a storm. All of these became signals. Humans watch the world not just with their eyes, but with an emerging awareness that every phenomenon carried a message. This shift in perception is one of the most important steps toward early spirituality. Nature became a teacher that revealed truths through symbols rather than speech. And even though these signs were often ambiguous, they were powerful enough to shape the collective imagination. This growing sensitivity to the environment laid the foundation for a deeper emotional understanding of the sacred. By observing fire, storms, winds, and the rhythms of the earth, early humans discovered that meaning could be found in the movement of the world itself. And as this perception evolved, it opened yet another door inside the human mind, preparing them to sense something even more profound that did not come from outside, but from deep within themselves. As early humans became more attentive to the movements of fire, storms, and shifting landscapes, something else began to evolve inside them. Something that was not triggered by the outside world, but by their internal responses to it. Emotions, which had always been tools for survival, slowly transformed into pathways for meaning. Fear sharpened awareness, admiration softened it. Curiosity opened space for imagination, and silence amplified everything that could not be explained. These early emotional states were raw, powerful, and unfiltered, creating impressions that shaped how our ancestors interpreted the world around them. They did not merely observe nature, they felt it. And through feeling, they began to form the first symbolic ideas of the sacred. Consider the moment when a group of early humans walked through a dense forest at dusk. Every sound, every scent, every movement triggered instinctive reactions. A sudden rustle might provoke fear, not just because of danger, but because it stirred the sense that unseen forces surrounded them. When they saw a towering tree struck by lightning, admiration mixed with vulnerability. When they gazed at a distant horizon glowing with dawn light, a quiet awe settled over them. These emotions did not vanish. They lingered, and from that lingering tension emerged the earliest symbolic associations. A tree was no longer just a tree. It could represent strength, shelter, or a memory of something unspoken. A stone was not just a stone. It could carry weight beyond its physical form. Each emotional imprint became a thread in a tapestry of meaning. This growing inner world allowed the earliest humans to connect experiences in ways they had never done before. A frightening night might later influence how they interpreted a storm. A moment of calm near a river might shape how they understood loss. Memories fused with sensations, and sensations fused with interpretations. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the human mind began creating symbolic relationships between external events and internal emotions. This was the psychological birthplace of the sacred. Before myths, before rituals, before language could articulate belief, there were emotional echoes shaping perception. These emotional patterns did more than guide instincts. They created the earliest forms of intuition. Intuition became a bridge between the physical world and the emerging spiritual landscape. When early humans felt fear, they imagined threats that were not visible. When they felt admiration, they sensed forces beyond themselves. When they experienced grief, they glimpsed a world that might exist beyond life. Their inner experiences expanded the horizon of what they believed was possible. In this sense, spirituality was not born from knowledge but from feeling, not from doctrine, but from the deep emotional reactions that shaped how they navigated existence. As these emotional associations accumulated over countless generations, they formed a foundation that allowed humans to imagine realities that stretched beyond survival. And this expanding inner landscape opened the way for phenomena that would become even more powerful in shaping early spiritual thought. carrying the human mind into realms that felt both familiar and mysterious. Before we continue, tell me something. Which emotion do you think would have shaped the sacred most strongly in those ancient minds? Share your thought in the comments using one word that captures it. As emotions began shaping the earliest symbolic connections in the human mind, another force quietly entered this emerging spiritual landscape: dreams. Long before language allowed humans to describe their inner experiences, dreams offered something no waking moment could provide. They brought images without the world, voices without bodies, movements without physical effort, and encounters that defied every natural law. To the earliest humans, who relied entirely on sensory reality to survive, dreams were not illusions. They were events. They felt as real as the hunt, as vivid as danger, and sometimes even more powerful than any moment lived during the day. This made dreams one of the first portals to what they perceived as a hidden realm. Imagine an early human falling, asleep near a fire, exhausted from a day of searching for food. As their mind drifted, they suddenly saw a departed companion walking toward them, speaking in gestures or sounds beyond comprehension. Or perhaps they found themselves running through a landscape they had never seen, filled with creatures that did not exist in the waking world. When they opened their eyes, the world was unchanged, but something inside them was not. The boundary between life and death, between reality and imagination, was no longer fixed. Dreams blurred the line. They suggested that consciousness could travel, that something within them could move freely in ways the body never could. This changed everything. Because dreams allowed early humans to revisit fears, desires, losses, and mysteries, they became a natural extension of their growing spiritual intuition. A frightening dream might be interpreted as a warning. A comforting dream might feel like guidance. A dream of a predator might influence the entire group's decisions. These nocturnal experiences carried weight because they emerged from a place beyond control. If the waking world taught them to read nature's signs, dreams taught them to read the signs arising from within themselves. This dual awareness deepened their spiritual perception. The mind was no longer just a tool for survival. It became a gateway. Over time, patterns began to emerge. If several members of a group had dreams of heavy rain or distant fire, it could be seen as a message from forces they did not yet understand. Dreams were woven into the fabric of communal meaning. They opened ways for individuals to share inner visions, shaping collective belief even before language existed to express it clearly. The dream world became a shadow realm of symbols, emotions, and mysteries, enhancing the sense that reality was layered, that the visible world was only part of the human experience. This growing connection between dreams and spiritual meaning expanded the early human imagination far beyond survival. It encouraged them to interpret human existence as something influenced by forces both external and internal. And as these dream visions accumulated in their collective memory, they inspired new kinds of behavior, guiding the creation of early practices that would soon begin to shape spiritual communities around fire, stone, and shared mystery, preparing the ground for something far more organized than instinct alone. As dreams expanded the inner landscape of early humans, something remarkable began to happen in their waking lives as well. Their shared experiences of fear, awe, grief, and wonder gradually transformed isolated impressions into collective meaning. The solitary sense of mystery became a communal force. When individuals gathered around the fire, their emotional worlds began to merge, creating a fragile but growing sense of unity. This was the beginning of the first spiritual community, long before rituals had names or structures, long before beliefs were spoken or passed down. It emerged through instinct, repetition, and the shared desire to understand the forces shaping their existence. Imagine a group returning from a hunt at dusk. Their bodies are tired, their senses still alert. As they settle near the flames, one of them begins to mimic the movement of an animal they encountered. Another repeats a sound from deep within the forest. These gestures are not performances, they are attempts to give form to the day's emotions. As the fire crackles, others join in, repeating the gestures or adding new ones, and soon the group finds itself in a rhythm of movement, sound, and expression. Without realizing it, they are creating the earliest form of ritual, a spontaneous ceremony born from shared memory and instinctive interpretation. These gatherings were more than moments of rest. They were opportunities for the group to process the unseen. The shadows cast on the stone walls around them became silent participants, shifting shapes that mirrored the dancers' movements and stirred the imagination. Early humans may have felt that these shadows were more than simple reflections, that something was moving with them, watching them, guiding them. This sensation reinforced the idea that the world beyond the physical was not separate from their lives but intertwined with it. Through rhythm, firelight, and shared emotion, they created a symbolic space where the boundary between the natural and the sacred seemed to dissolve. Over generations, these spontaneous practices became more intentional. Certain places felt charged with meaning. The mouth of a cave, a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, a rocky hill overlooking a wide plain. Groups returned to these locations repeatedly, sensing that these spaces held power. Here they would gather, move, hum, chant in simple tones, paint their bodies with earth pigments or place stones in meaningful patterns. Each gesture carried emotional weight, transforming ordinary spaces into sacred ones. These early rituals did not follow rules, yet they offered structure to the intangible, giving humans a way to externalize what they felt inside. This collective expression strengthened social bonds. It offered comfort during loss, courage during danger, and unity during uncertainty. It allowed early humans to feel part of something beyond themselves, something shared yet mysterious. And as these communal practices deepened, they started shaping a new kind of awareness that blended survival, imagination, and intuition. This awareness paved the way for a more defined relationship with the invisible forces they sensed all around them, setting the stage for the next transformation in humanity's ancient search for meaning. As the first communal rituals grew more frequent and emotionally charged, early humans began sensing that the world around them was shaped by more than physical events. They noticed patterns that repeated, rhythms in nature that felt intentional, and coincidences that seemed far too meaningful to ignore. A successful hunt after a night of collective chance, a sudden storm following a moment of fear, or the appearance of an animal shortly after a symbolic gesture. These experiences began to form the idea that unseen forces interacted with their lives. The sacred was no longer just a feeling or an instinct. It was becoming an active presence, something that influenced survival and demanded attention. When they looked at the world through this growing spiritual awareness, everything carried potential meaning. A shift in the wind could feel like a warning. The behavior of an animal could seem like guidance. The glow of sunrise might be interpreted as a sign of renewal. These associations were not random. They were built on emotional memory, dreams, shared rituals, and the instinctive belief that nature responded to them in ways too subtle for their senses to fully grasp. In this emerging worldview, the invisible became as important as the visible. Forces without form gained personality, intention, and influence. Humans began to act as if they were being watched, protected, challenged, or instructed by something beyond their understanding. This belief shaped daily choices. A hunter might hesitate before entering a forest that felt quiet in the wrong way. A group might move their sleeping area because the night's shadows evoked an unsettling presence. A stone formation discovered by chance could become an anchor point for gathering simply because it felt charged with significance. Over time, these interpretations created an unspoken system of meaning. Without formal myths or structured teachings, early humans were already living within a spiritual framework, guided by impressions rather than doctrines. The sacred became a force that touched every part of life: danger, shelter, food, illness, recovery, family, and fear. This invisible guidance strengthened the group's unity. When the unseen was interpreted collectively, individuals felt supported. Their fears were validated, their hopes shared, and their uncertainties held within a common story. The belief that something larger influenced their existence brought comfort during hardship and meaning to otherwise inexplicable events. It encouraged them to look beyond immediate survival, to search for patterns that connected the physical world to the internal one. This merging of instinct, interpretation, and shared emotion marked a profound shift in human consciousness. It laid the foundation for spiritual structures that would later evolve into myths, deities, and organized belief systems. And as these forces became more defined in their imagination, they began shaping not just how humans acted, but what they created, inspiring symbolic objects, markings, and forms of expression that carried spiritual weight far beyond their physical appearance. Before we move on, tell me something. Which invisible force do you think early humans feared or respected the most? Leave your thought in the comments using a single short phrase that captures your idea. As early humans continued to sense unseen forces shaping their world, they also began leaving marks that captured these invisible impressions. What started as instinctive gestures during rituals slowly evolved into deliberate creations. The caves, trees, stones, and bones around them became surfaces where their inner experiences could take form. At first, these markings may have seemed like simple traces, but over time they carried spiritual weight. A handprint on a cave wall was not merely decoration, it was presence. It was a sign that someone wished to anchor themselves in a place where they felt something powerful. And as these symbolic expressions multiplied, they became extensions of the sacred itself. Imagine a dark cave illuminated by a flickering torch. One person presses a hand covered in red pigment onto the stone surface. Another draws the shape of an animal they had seen only in a dream. A third arranges small stones in a circle without knowing why, driven by an intuitive sense that the pattern reflects something meaningful. These actions were not yet art as we understand it. They were attempts to materialize experiences that could not be spoken. Each mark represented an emotion, a fear, a hope, or a moment of connection with forces they believed surrounded them. The physical world became a canvas for their spiritual imagination. Totems and carved objects also emerged in this period. A piece of wood shaped into a recognizable form, a bone etched with repeated lines, or a stone polished until it fit perfectly in the palm. These objects were more than tools. They functioned as physical reminders of invisible realities. When held during rituals or placed near the fire, they seemed to channel the presence of whatever early humans believed guided or protected them. These objects allowed the sacred to be carried, shared, and preserved, deepening the connection between individuals and the unseen world they sensed. These symbolic creations served another purpose as well. They strengthened group identity. When a group painted the same cave or carved similar symbols, they reinforced the idea that their experiences were part of something collective. Meaning was no longer held only in emotions or dreams, but also in shared symbols. A painted animal might embody courage. A spiral carved into stone might represent a journey. A cluster of dots might evoke a memory of a storm. The more these symbols appeared, the more they shaped the group's internal narrative. They became anchors in the evolving spiritual landscape. As these objects accumulated across generations, they created continuity. Descendants could encounter marks left by ancestors and feel connected to them through shared meaning. Even without spoken stories, these symbols preserved spiritual memory. They allowed the sacred to be experienced not just through the environment, but through human creation itself. And as this symbolic world grew richer, it laid the foundation for the emergence of individuals who would eventually take on a special role in interpreting the invisible, guiding the group through mysteries that were becoming increasingly complex. As symbolic objects and sacred markings spread through early human communities, something else began to take shape within the group. The emergence of individuals who seemed unusually sensitive to the invisible forces surrounding them. These were the ones who dreamed more vividly, who interpreted signs more confidently, who felt patterns in nature with an instinct that others trusted. Over time, such individuals were seen not only as members of the group, but as mediators between the physical world and the mysterious realm that early humans believed influenced their lives. This was the birth of the first spiritual guides, the earliest ancestors of what would later become shamans, seers, and healers. Imagine someone within the group who consistently reacted to strange events with calm certainty. When an animal behaved unpredictably, they sensed meaning in it. When a storm struck suddenly, they recognized a message in its timing. When others awoke from disturbing dreams, this person could weave those fragments into interpretations that felt reassuring or insightful. They were not chosen by authority or tradition. They emerged naturally, shaped by their sensitivity, their emotional depth, and their ability to connect the seen and unseen worlds in a way that inspired trust. Their presence gave the group a sense of orientation, a feeling that someone understood the forces they feared and respected. These individuals often carried the symbolic objects created by the group, using them as tools to anchor their interpretations. A carved stone might serve as a focus for concentration. A painted symbol might remind them of patterns observed over time. When they held these objects during rituals or gatherings, others perceived them as channels linking the community to whatever invisible powers shaped existence. Even without formal beliefs, these acts gave structure to the group's understanding of the sacred. The spiritual guide became a living symbol, a figure who embodied the connection between human intuition and the mysteries beyond human control. Their role extended beyond rituals. They advised hunters on when to travel or where danger might lie. They comforted families after loss by interpreting dreams or signs that suggested continuity beyond death. They reinforced group cohesion by offering explanations for storms, illnesses, or unexpected events that might otherwise fracture the community. Their interpretations did not always rely on direct observation. They relied on an emerging inner logic, a blend of memory, instinct, and imagination that shaped how they understood the world. Through them, the sacred gained direction. This growing reliance on the spiritual guide transformed the emotional landscape of early humans. Fear became more bearable when someone claimed to understand its source. Uncertainty became less paralyzing when someone could give it meaning. Hope became stronger when someone recognized signs of renewal in nature. As these dynamics grew, the idea of a person who could navigate both worlds, inner and outer, became essential to the group's survival and identity. Over generations, this figure evolved into a central pillar of early spiritual life, shaping the way humanity approached the invisible before gods had names or myths took form. And from this evolving role, a new layer of meaning began to rise, one that would bind communities across vast distances and thousands of years. preparing the way for the transformation of the sacred into something even more structured and enduring. As the presence of spiritual guides became essential to early communities, the understanding of the sacred reached a new stage. Humans were no longer reacting only to instincts, dreams, or natural signs. They were beginning to organize their inner world, shaping meaning with a structure that went beyond individual intuition. Over generations, this slow and subtle transformation changed the nature of belief itself. The invisible forces that once appeared as shifting emotions or unpredictable signs now became familiar, recognizable, and increasingly shared across larger groups. What had been simple impressions grew into patterns, and patterns began to form explanations. These explanations were not yet myths, but they carried the seeds of what would later become organized religion. Imagine groups separated by mountains or long distances, developing similar ideas independently. One might believe that storms carried messages from an unseen power. Another might interpret death as a passage rather than an end. Another might see fire as a living presence that protected and punished. These ideas did not come from communication between groups, but from the human mind, reaching for meaning in similar environments. The spiritual imagination was beginning to unify humanity long before any written tradition, creating a common thread between people who would never meet. The sacred was becoming a collective inheritance. As generations passed, symbolic markings, sacred objects, and the guidance of intuitive leaders shaped more structured practices. Certain places became known as powerful. Certain gestures repeated themselves across time. Certain dreams carried more weight than others. Gradually, the sacred acquired a kind of internal logic, not rigid or formal, but coherent enough to guide behavior, shape rituals, and influence decisions. In this stage, spirituality was no longer just a response to mystery. It was an active framework for interpreting life. The earliest humans were building something that reached beyond survival, something that made the world feel connected, intentional, and full of purpose. This evolution marked the transition from a purely instinctive spirituality to the foundations of religious thought. Not yet gods, not yet myths, but the early architecture of belief, formed through repetition, emotion, memory, and the shared need to understand existence. What emerged was not a set of rules but a worldview. Humans began to see themselves as part of something larger, something that shaped seasons, guided choices, and offered continuity between life and death. This expanding sense of connection set the stage for the later rise of deities, cosmologies, and sacred stories that would dominate human history. But here, in this early moment, belief was still fluid, alive, and intimately tied to the rhythms of the world. If you reach this point, tell me in the comments by writing the phrase, "This message was for me," so I know you felt the depth of this journey. And if this exploration of ancient spirituality resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you can keep diving into stories that uncover how our earliest ancestors shaped the world we live in. Leave a like if the narrative helped you see the past through a new lens. And when you are ready, there is another video right here that continues this path in a way that expands everything we uncovered today. Click and come with me as we move deeper into the origins of the human experience.